Imagine a clock so famous that millions of people think its name belongs to a tower. Imagine a sound so familiar that it can make an entire city feel like itself. Four faces looking out over London, a great bell hidden high above the River Thames, and a tower standing beside Parliament as fog. War, protest, coronations, funerals, and the slow fading of an empire passed beneath it. This is Big Ben. But Big Ben is not only a clock, it is a witness. Strictly speaking, Big Ben is not the tower. It is the great bell inside the clock tower at the Palace of Westminster. The tower itself is now called the Elizabeth Tower, but history does not always obey official names. People heard the bell, saw the clock, looked up at the tower, and folded them into one image. Big Ben became the sound of London, the clock became the face of Britain, and the tower became a vertical line between ordinary time and national memory. To understand why Big Ben matters, we have to begin not with the clock, but with fire. In 1834, the old Palace of Westminster burned. Flames consumed a medieval world of chambers, records, wood, smoke, and political memory. London watched the seat of Parliament turn red against the night. Out of that destruction came a question. What should Britain build in its place? Not only a new building, but a new image of power. The answer would rise in stone, glass, iron, and time. The new Palace of Westminster was built to look ancient and modern at once. Its Gothic Revival style reached backward toward medieval tradition, while its engineering belonged to the industrial age. It was a perfect contradiction for Victorian Britain, a country that loved old symbols, but was changing faster than almost any society on Earth. Railways were shrinking distance, factories were changing labor, ships and telegraphs were tying continents together, and beside Parliament, a clock tower would soon turn time into architecture. Sir Charles Barry designed the new palace, but the clock tower's spirit came from Augustus Pugin, a brilliant designer obsessed with Gothic detail. Pugin gave the tower its vertical drama, its pointed elegance, its carved surfaces, its feeling of prayer and power. Yet this was not a church. It was Parliament. It was government wrapped in Gothic memory. And at its top, the clock would not only decorate the building, it would discipline the city with the visible authority of time. The clock itself was an extraordinary challenge. It had to be large enough for London to see, accurate enough for a nation learning to run on schedules, and strong enough to resist wind pressing against its great hands. Victorian Britain was becoming a world of timetables, trains, factories, newspapers, ships, parliamentary sessions, and imperial administration. In that world, accurate time was not a luxury. It was power measured in seconds. Inside the tower, hidden from the crowds below, the great clock became a machine of discipline. Its mechanism was made of cast iron, heavy gears, a long pendulum, and an escapement designed to keep the movement steady, even when London weather pressed against the clock faces. Pennies could be used to fine-tune the pendulum, changing the clock's speed by fractions of a second. That detail feels almost poetic, an empire of ships and colonies, adjusted by small coins above a swinging weight. Then came the bell. The first great bell failed. It cracked before it could become the voice of the tower. A second bell was cast, raised into place, and given the nickname that would travel across the world, Big Ben. But even this bell cracked after it began striking. Instead of being discarded, it was turned slightly, struck in a different place, and given a lighter hammer. Its imperfection became part of its voice. The sound Britain came to recognize was not the sound of perfection. It was the sound of survival after damage. When Big Ben finally rang, it gave London something more than a note. It gave the city a pulse. The bell marked hours over the Thames. The clock faces glowed above Westminster. Politicians entered and left. Carriages passed. Workers hurried through foggy streets. The poor, the powerful, the clerks, the dockers, the journalists, the ministers, and the servants, all moved under the same measured sound. In a deeply unequal society, The clock belonged to everyone who could hear it. Big Ben began its life when the British Empire was approaching its greatest confidence. London was not just a capital city, it was the center of a system that reached across oceans. Ships carried goods, soldiers, laws, languages, and ambitions. Maps in offices were colored with imperial red. Telegraph cables tightened the world. The sun was said never to set on the empire, and in Westminster, the clock kept time beside the parliament that claimed to govern so much of that world. This is why Big Ben became more than a landmark. It stood at the meeting point of time and power. Empire needs clocks. It needs schedules, reports, routes, deadlines, departures, arrivals, taxes, votes, and orders. It needs time to appear stable. But time does not only serve power. Time also exposes it. Every hour Big Ben struck. The empire grew older. Every chime measured not only Britain's confidence, but the beginning of its eventual fading. Then came the First World War. The empire that had seemed so sure of itself marched into a conflict that swallowed a generation. Men left railway stations under flags and music. Many returned wounded, silent, or not at all. Big Ben still marked the hours, but time felt different after the trenches. The old world did not survive intact. Britain won, but victory carried grief. Beneath the clock, Parliament debated sacrifice, debt, memory, and a new century that no longer trusted old certainties. Between the wars, Big Ben became part of a new kind of national intimacy. Radio carried its chimes into homes far from Westminster. People who had never stood beside the Thames could hear the bell before the news. A sound once limited by distance became a shared ritual. It entered kitchens, sitting rooms, factories, ships, and distant stations. Big Ben was no longer only heard by London. It became the opening note of Britain speaking to itself. Then came the Second World War. London was bombed. Fires burned through the night. Searchlights crossed the sky. Families slept in underground stations. Parliament itself was damaged. But Big Ben continued to stand above Westminster, a dark shape against smoke and flame. Its sound became more than a time signal. It became reassurance. As long as the chimes could be heard, something of Britain still seemed unbroken, not untouched, not victorious yet, but present. Across the world, those chimes carried meaning. For listeners under occupation, in exile at sea or in distant parts of the empire, the sound of Big Ben could feel like a thread connecting them to London. A bell cannot stop bombs. A clock cannot end war. But symbols matter most when reality is darkest. Big Ben did not promise that Britain would never suffer. It promised that suffering had not yet silenced the country's voice. After the war, the empire began to fade more visibly. India became independent. Colonies became nations. Old assumptions weakened. Britain was still powerful, but no longer in the same way. The world that had made London the center of global command was changing, and Big Ben watched it happen from the same place beside the Thames. The hands moved, the bell struck, governments changed, flags changed, maps changed, but the clock remained. There are moments when nations discover that the story they tell about themselves no longer matches the world around them. For Britain, the decades after 1945 were filled with those moments. The empire became the Commonwealth. Imperial certainty became debate. Power moved across the Atlantic. Immigration changed the face of British cities. Industry declined in some places. New voices demanded to be heard. Big Ben, once the sound of imperial confidence, became something more complicated, the sound of continuity after loss. That complication is part of its power. Big Ben stands beside Parliament, but it does not belong only to politicians. It has watched crowds gather for celebration and anger, for mourning and protest, for royal ceremonies and democratic demands. It has seen new prime ministers arrive and old ones leave. It has seen laws pass that changed lives far beyond Westminster. The clock has no opinion, but it keeps witnessing. In that silence, it becomes a mirror. In the 21st century, Big Ben itself needed care. The tower was wrapped in scaffolding. The bells fell silent for restoration. The clock faces were repaired, the stonework cleaned, the mechanism protected, and the old building was prepared for another century of weather and memory. For a while, London looked at the tower and saw absence. The silence reminded people of something simple. Even the symbols that seem permanent survive, only because someone chooses to preserve them. When the chimes returned, they did not return to the same Britain that first heard them in the 19th century. The empire was gone, the city was more global, the politics were louder, the old certainties were fewer, but perhaps that is why the sound still mattered. Big Ben no longer needed to announce imperial power. It could announce endurance. A country can lose an empire and still keep a voice. A clock can outlive the age that created it and still speak to the age that follows. That is the deeper meaning of Big Ben. It reminds Britain that time does not belong to any empire. Time measures kings and queens, workers and ministers, victories and mistakes, beginnings and endings. It turns confidence into memory. It turns power into history. It turns monuments into questions. What remains when a nation's greatest age has passed? What survives when maps are redrawn? What continues to ring when the world no longer listens in the same way? Big Ben's answer is not loud in the way an empire was loud. It is steady. Hour after hour, across fog and sunlight, through celebration and crisis, it tells London that history is still moving. The clock that watched an empire fade did not stop when the empire faded. It remained beside the river, above Parliament, above traffic, tourists, protests, and ceremonies, not as proof that Britain is unchanged, but as proof that nations survive by changing while still remembering the sound of who they used to be. So when Big Ben rings over Westminster, it is not only marking the hour, it is marking the distance between past and present. It is the sound of a city that burned and rebuilt, a parliament that argued through centuries, an empire that rose and faded, and a country still asking what it means to be itself. If this story made you hear Big Ben differently, let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about how monuments become memory, don't forget to subscribe. We will see you in the next one.